So I'm with Charles Powell from Elcano Royal Institute. So Charles, historically, what have been the main strengths and weaknesses between the Russian and Spanish relations?
This is a rather strange relationship because Spain and Russia only restored diplomatic relations in 1977, so it's really quite a recent one. But if we go further back in time, I think there are elements of what I call a sort of atavistic attraction. In other words, Spaniards in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, especially intellectual elites, believed that there were certain similarities or certain affinities between Spain and Russia. It's rather a romantic, sort of spiritual, irrational interpretation of the relationship, but there's this notion that these two old civilizations on the periphery of Europe, which were sort of ill-equipped for modernization, ill-equipped for liberalism, democracy and so on, somehow had something in common. And this atavism, I think, is what really informs this relationship. But other than that, to be honest, the relationship hasn't really had much substance, even in relatively recent years.
And how has the crisis in Crimea changed these relations, if at all?
Well, that's an interesting and a difficult question to answer. I think that there are four main attitudes, and I'm following a very interesting article by the European Council on Foreign Relations here. Spanish attitudes towards Russia can break down into four different groups. One group consists of what this author has called the understanders, in other words, people who basically think that we have been very hostile towards the Russian regime and that it was sort of inevitable that Russia should respond in this way. So the idea is basically, the Crimea is Russian anyway, so why are we getting so excited about this? The second attitude is what this article describes as the equidistants, in other words, people who feel that yes, Russia is to blame because it's used force against Crimea and the eastern Ukraine, but the EU is also to blame because perhaps we sent Ukrainian leaders the wrong signals, gave them the impression that we were actually contemplating accession when we weren't, and so on. The third group, or the third attitude, has been described as the pro-Maidan. In other words, people who are really mainly interested in democracy promotion and who strongly support basically the young revolutionaries who overthrew the former Ukrainian regime. And finally, we have the sort of the Atlanticist cold warriors, in other words, people who don't really care about the Ukraine and Russia that much. They basically worry about what all of this is doing to US power and influence in the world. So you have all those four attitudes are present in the Spanish political debate. In general, I've been surprised by how pro-Russian some sectors of Spanish society and even people in positions of authority have been, in the sense that they have been very understanding towards Russia's behavior and haven't really shown all that much sympathy for Ukrainian demands for democracy and freedom.
In response to that, in a recent speech, Lavrov declared that Russian-Spanish relations had reached a strategic partnership. However, if you actually look at the statistics, the levels of trade and investment between the two countries are really quite low. Can you really label it a strategic partnership if economic relations are that modest?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it points to this fundamental paradox. Both the Spanish and the Russian authorities speak in terms of this strategic element, and yet both in terms of trade and in terms of investment, this is not a really significant relationship for either country. Tourism is perhaps the only area which is slightly different. The number of Russian tourists visiting Spain has increased by 30% year on year, and 1.5 million Russians visited Spain last year. But if you remember that over 60 million people visited Spain, that's still a relatively... Yeah. So I don't really think there is anything truly strategic about this relationship right now.
We both know Spain is very dependent on Russia for oil. Do you think that European sanctions against Russia will threaten Spanish-Russian relations?
Yeah, right now about 18% of the oil that Spain imports originates in Russia. So it's actually one of the top three sources, together with Mexico and Nigeria. So that actually makes Spain, as you were saying, more dependent than people generally realize. However, when the EU agreed to sanctions against Iran, Spain adopted them quite happily, even though it was importing 14% of its oil from Iran at the time. So the question really, though, is whether we expect sanctions to escalate to that extent. And frankly, given the EU's overall rather wishy-washy attitude towards Russia during the crisis, I very much doubt that we will be facing sanctions on that scale. So I don't really expect the sanctions regime to escalate to an extent where it might actually endanger the bilateral relationship.
Thank you very much, Charles.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.